Good morning, Deacon Ed McCormick here. I was inspired during the 9:30 Mass to shoot a short video between this Mass and the next. And I think we want to call this Insurrection versus the Gospel Part 2. My previous video was Part 1, this is Part 2. And it's based on this Sunday's Gospel, which begins with John the Baptist and some of his followers watching as Jesus walks past the Jordan River, and John points out and says, "This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And as we have been viewing video after video on the news of the events that have taken place at the Capitol, we, in a sense, get a vision of what the sins of the world look like. You can easily recall the angry mob scaling the walls of the Capitol, rushing the steps of the Capitol, the Confederate flag being carried through the Capitol, police being beaten by American flags and crushed in the doors, the mob bringing in all kinds of weapons, a truck full of explosives, pipe bombs laid near the Capitol. And so these symbolic events and all that we've learned since the events, I think, bring to light what the sin of the world looks like that Jesus has come to drive out. And so a few reflections on that. First of all, the sin of the world always brings about lies and deceptions. And a big part of what was behind the Capitol event were a whole set of lies that were being promoted by our political leaders about how the election had been stolen, how the election was fraudulent, and these lies fomented the violent actions of this crowd. And so the sin of the world always operates with lies and deceptions and half-truths. You'll notice that the sin of the world also brings about chaos. We saw the chaos in the halls of Congress. But the sin of the world also brings about chaos in our families and in our friendships, in government, in politics, in the business world. The events at the Capitol also show us how the sin of the world always involves hatred and violence. And we saw this played out at the Capitol, where people were killed, where people stormed the Capitol with the intention of perhaps kidnapping and killing members of Congress. People were chanting to kill the Vice President of the United States. So the sin of the world always involves violence and hatred. And in our country, it almost always involves white supremacy and racism. And this occurred at the Capitol as people wanted to take back the vote, and particularly the votes that were cast by African Americans in places like Philadelphia, places like Wisconsin, places like Detroit, Michigan. And so underneath this sin of the world in our country is almost always racism and white supremacy. Now, let's go back to today's gospel, because you get to see the contrast between the sin of the world and what Jesus brings our world and offers us. When John the Baptist says to the disciples, "Look, there is the Lamb of God," they leave John and they follow Jesus. And as they do, he turns around and he asks them, "What do you want? What is it you desire?" And they say, "Where do you live?" Now, they're not asking for his address. This idea of where does Jesus live or dwell or abide is this deep theme in John's gospel. It's this idea that Jesus abides out of the inexhaustible, infinite life of God, the love and power and creative presence of God that wells up within him. And what these guys are invited to do by Jesus is come and see. He says, come and see. What a beautiful invitation. Come and find out for yourself. I'm not going to tell you. Come and experience what it's like to discover where I come from. And so they go and spend the day with him. And I invite you to imagine yourselves walking into that house, sitting at the table with Jesus. There's glasses and wine and pita bread and hummus and all kinds of food there, and you spend the day with him. And as you sit in that room with him, you can feel its warmth, its welcome. You experience his hospitality. No matter what you've done or said or haven't done, he welcomes you. And as you're sitting in that room, you can feel this energy radiating from him. It's an energy that seems to release your fears and your insecurities and your emptiness and fill you and anybody else who's there with a peace that's not just internal, but it's a peace that connects us in new, fresh ways to each other. Out of Jesus' presence comes this new kind of renewing peace, this reconciling power, this power that breaks down the forces of hostility. And so you get this contrast this Sunday between what the sin of the world does, producing lies and violence and hatred and chaos, compared to the gospel, the life that Jesus is bringing us, that always brings truth and peace and love and justice. And we are once again invited to say no to the sin of the world and yes to the life of the gospel, and try and embody it in everything we do.